I would much rather that we had an election campaign that was fought on the underlying policy programmes that each of the prospective governments would implement, which are far more about the regeneration and development of towns and cities up and down the UK, where those jobs will be, what we do about nature and beautiful landscapes around us. And these are the key issues that actually really do matter for net zero, but aren't necessarily framed as net zero issues.
Chris, I wanted to start by welcoming you to the Carbon Trust. What was it that drew you to the Carbon Trust for the next stage in your career?
Well, working with you, Simon. I aside from that, have long looked at what Carbon Trust does. I think that maybe that's part of it. I've worked now in climate change for quite a long time, approaching 15 years now of looking at energy and climate policies. And all the way through that, Carbon Trust was this sort of presence. And what's interesting, I think, about Carbon Trust is how much it's changed as an organisation over time. I want to work in an organisation that works right at the edge of pushing the transition, and one that's global. So I come from an organisation that looked at the UK. I want to move on to look at the global issues. Carbon Trust is perfect for that. And I also want to get involved in actually pushing the pace and actually implementing some of the solutions. Carbon Trust is the organisation for me, I think. So it's a pretty special place. And you just need to look at the wonderful people who've worked in this organisation and where they've gone as well. So it's doing a really important role. Maybe the final thing I'll say is that I wouldn't want to work in an organisation if I didn't feel there was something more to do. Right. So, there's a big part of me that wants to shift the emphasis here in Carbon Trust. And we might talk about that today.
That would be great. Funny you should mention that. Obviously, the climate landscape has changed enormously since the Carbon Trust was founded, over 23 years ago now. In terms of the politics of climate change, the economics of the solutions, the mobilisation that exists across the issue now. But at the same time, clearly, we've seen that climate impacts have got more and more severe. How do you think the Carbon Trust should evolve as a result of that development, evolution in the issue?
So 23 years is a long time to work on these issues because they're actually quite new in terms of policies and the solutions that we see being implemented globally now. 23 years is a very long time. We're going to have to keep changing the emphasis. And partly that's because we're being successful now on some aspects of decarbonisation. I don't think this story's known enough, actually, that right about the time I started my last job, about 7 years ago, that was actually the point when global investment in green energy or clean energy overtook fossil. So we're right now, today, starting to see the benefits of that, which it might not be obvious from the fact that global emissions are still going up, but we're going to start seeing places like China reach peak emissions soon because we've been rolling out renewables particularly. And each renewable package of new renewables that we install in China or in the UK shaves off a bit more of our demand for fossil fuels. So we're at a key point. The Carbon Trust has been hugely influential in some of that story already, particularly on things like offshore wind. We've brought down successfully through the programs that we've run in this organisation the cost of offshore wind to quite an extraordinary degree by being collaborative, by doing research and development, by showing that there was a cheaper way forward and a bigger scale way forward for that sector. There's lots more of that still to do, but we're going to have to move our focus now, I think, onto a set of new sectors, principally, into the whole idea of the impact that corporates are having through their supply chains. That's where you find the emissions that are causing climate change. And we're still at the beginning, really, of understanding how we deal with supply chain emissions. And then there's a whole other basket of issues, which sadly I think we also have to deal with. If we're dealing with climate, it's not just about decarbonising. We also need to accept that we're in a world where we're decarbonising as the world warms. So a package of things about how resilient we are to climate change, how we adapt to climate change, alongside getting on a path to net zero. I think bringing these two things together, actually that's another area where Carbon Trust can be real specialists and to be the pioneers that we've been in other areas again.
Accelerating the transition has always been core to the Carbon Trust mission. As those impacts that you talk about get more and more severe, how do you think we should honour that part of our mission now? What should that accelerate piece of it look like in your view for the Carbon Trust?
I think for Carbon Trust, we can't boil the ocean, to use that metaphor. So it'd be nice to think that we could have accelerators right across every corner of the global economy and you really sort of, own the space. but we aren't going to be able to do that. So for an organisation of this size, I think it's really important that we specialise in some aspects of this. And in a sense, we already do that. So I've already talked about the offshore wind accelerator, but that to me is the blueprint for how we go about this. But moving beyond offshore wind, there's a host of other areas where you need that same approach. So, for example, the transition in decarbonising buildings is probably the biggest challenge in Northern Europe. It is a challenge of also decarbonising the cooling of buildings in other parts of the world. The trouble with buildings is they have people in them. So actually finding solutions that work across millions of buildings. We're in London today, 30 million buildings in Britain. Each one of them has to be decarbonised. That means you have to have the permission of the person in that home to do something. That is a classic case of where you need an approach that helps accelerate that transition. It will look very different to an offshore wind accelerator, though, because we'll have to get right into not just the technologies, but the incentives and the feelings of the people in that who are tenants in those buildings. And those buildings, some of them are corporate tenants. So there's a whole set of other issues there, whole set of questions about how you bring whole communities together to do that. You could look at another aspect tied to the energy transition, the coal transition. We talk about the coal transition. It's nothing to do with coal. It's to do with jobs in the energy sector. And we use that coal term to sort of catch all. But actually, it's about what you do for people who want to have livelihoods in a place that presently rests on burning coal to generate electricity. We can be specialists at bringing together people to look at those issues, which are sometimes called the just transition issues. There's a host of these things. If we don't do these things well, we will not make net zero. And if we do them well, we can accelerate them. So I'm very, very much of the view that we should take a broad view of what it means to accelerate that transition and specialise in a few areas where we think we genuinely do have that expertise. Something like the food system, for example, the way in which we bring retailed food to consumers. That is a real expertise of ours in the Carbon Trust. It's a perfect example of where we need to think about the decarbonisation of that supply chain, but also how exposed it is to the climate risks. And accelerating our approach to all of that is really exciting for me, and it's very different to, again, an offshore wind accelerator.
Fantastic, thanks, Chris. Nina, over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks. We've talked a little bit about how you've joined at a time when climate impacts are really ramping up, but you've also joined at an interesting time because of the number of elections that are going to be happening around the world. So South Africa, Mexico and India, they've already been to the polls, but there's going to be votes in the EU and the US as well later this year. To what extent do you think the fate of the climate hangs in the balance with these elections?
I do think it hangs in the balance, but I'm also sure that one election doesn't determine that. So let's just say now that policy matters when it comes to tackling climate change. Policy for decarbonisation, policy for tackling the climate risks that we face. And although it's often discussed as a global concern, most of those policies that matter, at least, will still be determined at national level. So I think these elections will matter, but let me say something slightly more interesting about it. I don't think that you need to have climate change as an issue in every election. One of the challenges with any election is that, of course, you're voting on a set of issues. You can't really disagree with physics, right? So climate change is going to continue to happen regardless of those elections. What matters is the way in which these issues are framed to the populace in each of these places. And if there isn't a sort of positive, progressive discussion, particularly about the ways in which we will decarbonise, then we run into, quite quickly, the cultural barriers that you see in many parts of the world now to decarbonising, particularly decarbonising. So I think these elections really do matter, but I don't worry so much that we're not seeing climate change itself as a top level issue in each of these elections, because to me what matters is the way in which each of those democracies approaches the creation of jobs or new industries. That's far more fundamental, frankly, than climate policies as they're conventionally discussed.
Right. Well, I think, in future sessions we'll have opportunities to talk about all of these different elections. But for now, let's discuss the UK election, where a snap general election has just been announced very recently. To what extent do you think that climate is going to be a significant issue in the UK general election?
So it's already a significant issue. And as we talk today, I've just read an article in one of the UK newspapers, The Guardian, about how it isn't as big an issue as perhaps it should be. I mean, let me say now, I'm quite happy for climate not to be a top level issue in this UK election, because one of my worries is that it wouldn't really be about climate at all. It would be about this sort of hijack of the climate issues as basically analogous to a set of cultural issues. So what we've seen, somewhat surprisingly to me, is that net zero as a term has been hijacked. So I really wish that was not the case, but the slogan of net zero is now used very extensively as a container for a set of broader cultural concerns about the way in which government is determining the future for people's lives in this country. And most of that, sadly, is very ill-informed, but it is not helped by the fact that the Prime Minister last September framed net zero as a cost to be imposed on the UK, when in fact I think it's better framed as a huge opportunity for us. And that is the way I think we should think of it. But it doesn't matter that I think that. If net zero, in inverted commas, and it always is net zero always is in inverted commas when you read these articles, is seen as that kind of imposition, then it is difficult to make progress. And I would much rather that we had an election campaign that was fought on the underlying policy programmes that each of the prospective governments would implement, which are far more about the regeneration and development of towns and cities up and down the UK, where those jobs will be, what we do about nature and beautiful landscapes around us. And these are the key issues that actually really do matter for net zero, but aren't necessarily framed as net zero issues. Take something like energy security. That's been absolutely fundamental to the period that we've just been through in the UK. We can easily describe what we're trying to do in the UK on net zero as an energy security concern, and it's okay to do that. So I think this is probably the first election where net zero is a theme without being too explicit, or climate is a theme without that being too explicit. And I think that's probably quite a good thing, because we're exploring then hopefully what each of those party leaders actually wants to do with the country on the journey to net zero. And that is somewhere that we must reach inevitably. It's more interesting to ask the question how.
Yeah, really interesting. It's going to be interesting to see how it pans out. Thanks.
Absolutely. Building on that, the economy is probably set to be one of, if not the dominating issue of the election campaign here in the UK, and the extent to which solutions to the climate crisis can also bring economic benefits. What would be your top 3, 4, 5 priorities for the next government, whichever party wins the election, to ensure both economic prosperity and progress towards net zero in the UK?
I don't have a top 5, but let me start with a number 1 issue, which is we need to look beyond the UK borders. Now, this is not a pro-China or anti-China rant at this stage, but just to say that something is happening in China right now that is utterly remarkable. I don't know whether we will reach the fabled peak emissions this year in China, but we probably won't be far off it. And the reason that that's happening is because China is rolling out low carbon energy sources at a scale that is utterly astonishing. They also produce most of those. Solar panels and wind is the next thing for China too. And that is partly why they're rolling them out too. But just to give you a sense of that, last year China installed more solar and wind than the US has ever installed. If you look at the heat pumps that were installed in China, it is double what the rest of the world together installed. 3 times the electric vehicles than the rest of the world. So basically they are cleaning up the production of electricity, and they're cleaning up the end use of electricity. I don't think China's doing that through philanthropy. They're doing that because that's the future for the global economy. Joe Biden right now is slapping tariffs on those electric vehicles as a I think, failed attempt to try and hold off in a King Canute style strategy the flood of very cheap vehicles that is now coming from Chinese production lines. Why do I say all this? There's number 1 priorities for this election here in the UK, and indeed for all the other places around the world that will have elections this year. We need to be conscious that this is no longer really a climate concern at all. This is actually about the future of the global economy, and we need to embrace it. So my second point, I suppose, would be to say, in that world where we are seeing these remarkable shifts happening, let's be part of it and make that more fundamentally part of the economic strategy for this country. And I think we do need an industrial strategy here in the UK. as you see in other parts of the world, because that is the link then to the location of jobs, high value jobs in areas where we know we will need them. And maybe the last thing I'll say on this is, let's not forget we have been pioneers on some of this transition. There's too much negativity about that. I think we should be pleased about what we've achieved on something like offshore wind. That is world leading. We need more world leading things like that, but we can't imagine that we will world lead on everything. So let's also accept that some of this stuff is going to happen somewhere else and be proud about borrowing it when it does. And that to me is not so much a climate strategy or a climate manifesto, so much as a straightforward economic manifesto, because that's where the productivity improvements will come for the UK economy in the future.
Very interesting. Obviously, the US has responded to that challenge from China, if you like, not just through tariffs, but also through the Inflation Reduction Act. We've seen a parallel in the EU with the Net Zero Industry Act. When you talk about the UK needing an industrial strategy, are you envisaging something of that sort of scale for the UK, something ambitious with significant public investment?
Yes, but it's hard to do industrial strategies well. And I think even the topics, the issues that you raised, we could spend the rest of this discussion picking holes in the Inflation Reduction Act and the Net Zero Industry Act. Maybe I'll just go back. We in this country, in the UK, have had recent experience of an enormous industrial strategy, which we didn't call an industrial strategy, which was our willingness under previous administrations to put a tariff on bills that has paid for, very comfortably paid for, an enormous new renewables industry in this country, in which we have some of the highest value stuff now happening globally. That is an industrial strategy. And I think more of that very evidence-led focus could build out more of those sorts of industries. It's tempting at this stage to jump to hydrogen or carbon capture or steel or what, that actually, I don't think that's so important as saying that actually we need to be more bold in a handful of areas to develop those kind of high value jobs, hanging off strong policies that do that. We're never going to compete with the Inflation Reduction Act, but neither do I think we need to. Because the reason the Inflation Reduction Act is straightforwardly throwing a lot of cash at the wall because it's a piece of fiscal legislation. There are cleverer ways to do this with standard setting and regulation alongside some of those tax measures and spend measures that allow industries to feel confident enough to grow in this country. And that's essentially what we've seen in offshore wind. I would like to see more of that.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Nina, over to you.
Thanks. I want to talk a little bit about how we would actually implement any of the things that you've mentioned there. And we, Simon and I, have hosted a podcast series for the Carbon Trust together.
I've listened to it.
Great. I'm very happy to hear that.
And,
well, I hope you
Let's
listened
do
to
more
our
of them.
first episode where we hosted Sir Patrick Vallance, former Chief Scientific Advisor to the UK government. And he stressed that we need to approach climate change with the same level of urgency that we did the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of his suggestions for doing that was actually creating a series of task forces within government addressing key elements of the net zero transition. Do you agree with that kind of approach, or do you have other suggestions for how the architecture of government could actually be adapted to address this challenge more comprehensively?
Yeah, and I'm straight out of a role that looked more obviously at what government policy does, and part of that is looking at the question of how government itself is structured. So I certainly have views of it. I mean, the departmental structure that we have at the moment, in Whitehall particularly, in the UK, does not lend itself well to that kind of mission thinking. Yeah. And I think you need to cut through that, therefore. But here's where I might add a bit of colour, at least, to what Sir Patrick said. That only comes when there's clear leadership at the top. Yeah. So, funnily enough, we have been through periods when that was more obvious. Boris Johnson was a Prime Minister that very clearly wanted to see stuff happen on net zero, and that made it much easier for departments across Whitehall to know what to do on that. No, most of that wasn't programmed in. So, the department that does housing in Whitehall knew very simply that if they had policies that would help with net zero, it was worth implementing them. And that sort of mission thinking often just starts from a very clear communication of the priority that there is in government. So I think that is the most important thing. That said, I do think it's important that we structure ourselves well around the priorities underneath that. Yeah. So achieving net zero is not a simple affair. And I think here now we come to maybe the most important issue. The danger is in thinking that government can do it all itself. It can't.
Yeah.
So what it can do is shape the transition ahead, but it will be the private sector that leads it, inevitably, with the conscious decisions of consumers and people living in this country alongside that. But it is actually principally going to be, because it's an investment concern mainly, it will be businesses and private sector that lead that transition. They will want to see policies that help them to make the steps, and that those policies are more about shaping existing activities than they are creating brand new ones, funnily enough. So that requires a deeper thinking that runs through government with the private sector itself. It's not easy to do that. So I think from my perspective, when I think about what we need to do as a country to get to net zero, the next stage of this is to just be super clear about where we're heading. Thinking of it as a transition and spending more time actually defining the goals that we need to see in the future, and then allowing the private sector into the question of how you do that well and cheaply and in such a way that develops the jobs that we need in this country and all the economic benefits that come from that. And I think new governments often get the space to do that more easily than governments at the end of their administration. I'm not suggesting we need a change of government so much as fresh impetus to do this well. So that's what I'd like to see. Now, I actually see less focus on net zero and more focus on the underlying priorities for the buildings environment, for example, or for key industries that we need to. Let's get on to a question of what those industries themselves need to deliver, and then they'll do it. I think they'll do it, and the policies will be obvious to sit alongside it.
Yeah, and obviously net zero is a target that's a couple of decades away now. How do you think you can, instill urgency through government action, to focus on those interim milestones that you mentioned?
The urgency is obviously there because people every day now are experiencing climate change, and I think that it's you can underprice how important that is now. People in this country and all around the world are ready for this. I tend to think that politicians are behind the curve on this now. With every flood that you see, or every heat wave, or extreme fires that we get, as I'm sure we'll get this summer again, it just raises more and more the expectation that there will be something from our leaders to tackle that. And when we don't deliver that, I think that's when you get the proper problems starting. So I tend to think that the answer is there. I think the appetite to do more on this is already there. But what's missing is the willingness of our political leaders to step in and own it. So at the moment, we get this slightly odd thing happening, not just in this country, but other parts of the world too, where we're actually doing policy on climate, but our world leaders are not so sure they want to talk about it so much anymore. So you get quite a difficult, I've been calling it green hushing recently, like we're doing policy to decarbonise sector X, but let's not call it climate policies. Well, that won't work either. So I sort of feel that we need leaders that are informed enough and bold enough and brave enough to actually step back in and own this. And then it will feel like we are making progress on it, and that will satisfy a little, at least, of the demand that there is amongst people to see more progress on this. We haven't got that brand of leadership yet anywhere really, actually. So, I mean, part of the role here in the Carbon Trust might be to help our world leaders understand that this is an achievable thing. Like, I think we need to get on to talking progressively and positively about it again.
Fantastic. Lastly, Chris, you've recently said that the UK has lost its climate leadership on the world stage. Do you think the UK can be a climate leader again? And if so, how? What do you want to see the next government do, both internally and internationally, to reclaim that role?
I can absolutely reclaim its leadership. Now, in this room, we've been to COPs, UN climate summits. One thing that's very obvious if you're in those summits is the extent to which Britain is everywhere in them, because we really have, to a large degree, owned this sort of intellectual space on climate. I don't think that's enough, but it's there as an apparatus to reheat it. What's been absent, the reason that I made that statement that you referred to, isn't so much that we haven't done lots of good things on climate. I mean, if you look at our record in the UK in decarbonising, particularly the power sector, it's better than any other G20 economy. That's all in the past. Now, other parts of the world still have to make that journey, but we essentially spelled out a blueprint to do that. I wish we'd done it sooner, but we've done more on that than other countries. But when you look forward, the gap is yawning now, actually, in areas like transport, particularly buildings. We have a special challenge in this country of decarbonising buildings, most of which are heated with gas at the moment. whole industries that have been largely untouched. I'll give you a sense of this. Farming and land is a bigger source of emissions now than the power sector. Where's the policy on that? So, climate leadership is about looking forward, I think, much more than it is looking back. And then, if you're doing the forward stuff, you can then refer to how well it's going when you look back. And it's in that space, I think. So if you want to reclaim climate leadership, I think it is about spelling out that you have a program that looks for the next 5 to 10 years at moving into those new areas where the new opportunities lie. That allows you a platform to, again, regain that global leadership. We could easily do that in this country. In fact, I would like to see us do that because we have this intellectual heft on it. It will be better for the world to see the UK reclaiming that space because it will embolden other countries of the world to follow suit. So
to lead by example, but also to help other governments learn the lessons from our experience, both the good and the bad, so that they can...
Yeah, a criticism that's often levelled at me and others in this space is, what's the point? UK is, 2% of global emissions. So what's the point of tax? I've seen that played out several times now. And if you look at it in raw emissions terms, that's absolutely right. But here's the thing. The policies that we developed in this country, supported by the work that the Carbon Trust was doing on offshore wind, have pointed a way to cutting the cost of a key technology that other countries around the world can now deploy at a level that is cheaper because of UK policy making and industry supporting that. There is lots of that still to do. That is the leadership I'm talking about. Right. It's not so much the raw emissions. It's the policies and the industry response, the consumer response that goes with that, pointing to a way to do this. That is real leadership. That's why when you go to countless countries now around the world, you'll find that a contract for difference is going to be the policy that they're using to deploy renewables. That's enormous heft on that story. That's real influence. Yeah. I'd like to see more of that. And I think that is ultimately what we're here to do. But basically, an economy the size of the UK, our role is to demonstrate that it's possible to do this and that we see benefits from it. And then you get the broader impacts from that.
And of course, there's a lot the Carbon Trust can do to help with that.
We can be right in the heart of it. And the beauty of the Carbon Trust is that it swims in that sort of space between government and corporates. There aren't many people doing that sort of work. And we've got such a strong record over 23 years of doing this well. So we are here to support that translation, actually, as far as possible. And that's exciting for me. It's partly why I wanted to be in the Carbon Trust, because we're right in the middle of defining, some of the policy, but crucially getting into implementation. I don't really want to do anything other than implementation, if I'm honest, because delivery is the biggest challenge now for us here. We broadly know what we need to do to get to net zero. It's just not happening yet.
Chris, thank you very much indeed. Inspiring, exciting, and very much look forward to further conversations with you, including about developments internationally in future with you. So for now, thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Chris.
Thank you.